We're just so delighted to see such an incredible turnout tonight. I will now pass on to Lucas James to provide a welcome to country.
Thank you. It does really make me happy seeing all you here. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lucas James. The name given to me by my Larrakia elders is Danggalaba. Danggalaba is our saltwater crocodile. I'm here this afternoon as a young Kulumbirigin Larrakia man. I'm very proud of my culture, my people, and my country. I acknowledge our ancestors, all those who came before us. It's their bones and ashes that we stand on that give us our identity. I acknowledge and love my elders. They keep us strong, and I acknowledge all my other countrymen who are the future. If you don't know, us Larrakia mob are about 8 family groups. There's about 2,000 of us all together in Darwin. We're the traditional custodians of the lands and seas of the Greater Darwin area. The Larrakia Country stretches out about 50 kilometers to Gum Point in the northeast, to Mountain Dam to the south, and across the Kembe or Cox Peninsula to the west of here. We are saltwater and freshwater people. It's a bit shameful how urgent climate change has become, but it does make me really happy and really proud, no matter what age you are, that there are still a lot of people fighting for it. As we know, there are a lot of issues with Lee Point, and I believe, I can't remember, I got brain fart, the other place, sorry. But I do believe climate change is a very urgent thing that we need to fight for and keep fighting for. I see lots of rubbish, a lot of pollution, and it just breaks my heart seeing my land going grey. All I ask for you is to keep fighting, keep being strong people, and just make the best decisions by picking up a little bit of rubbish, keeping a little bit 10 cents. It doesn't take that much to make a big change. Not only do I want to do it for us, but for our future generations. As me, hopefully in 10 years' time, I want my own kids, and I want to make sure they live in a nice green, sunflower place, or in the city, either way, doesn't matter. Speaking of, sometimes in big cities, it's hard to see the TOs, but I like to remind people who come to Darwin that the land, the sea, and the law underneath all this development will always belong to Kulumbirigin Larrakia land. We will always be here. This is our traditional land, it is our family, it is our spirit. In a way, we care for our lands and everyone on it. I welcome you to our country, and I'm letting our ancestors know that you are here, so they keep you safe and protect you while you're visiting or staying. This is about connection with our ancestors, our country, and all of our people. With this connection, I also ask you to be mindful and responsible on our country, and return Gwalwa Daraniki, our land, and Daraba Nungalinga, Old Man Rock, our ancestor in the sea, will look after you and protect you. On behalf of my Larrakia elders, past, present, and emerging, Damara Gregory, Gwalwa Daraniki, I welcome you to your land. Please be strong. You mob are the best, amazing. Thank you so much for listening. Have a fantastic rest of the day. Thank you, and mama.
Thank you so much, Lucas. And as always, I ask you to remember that we are on the stolen, unceded lands of Larrakia people. They never ceded sovereignty over this country. Darwin was built here without Larrakia consent, and major developments continue to be pursued here without Larrakia consent, including at Binnaburra Point and at Middle Arm. I also acknowledge that Larrakia people are leading the campaigns to stop destruction at these places, as they always have, and First Nations people across the Northern Territory and Australia, including the amazing people up here on this stage, are also leading these campaigns, and we continue to be inspired by them. Thank you, Lucas, for your always beautiful and heartfelt welcome, and for your family's care for this land over so many generations. We're so grateful you could join us tonight. So tonight's event has a dual purpose. I'm not here to just talk about climate change and how we all feel about it. We're here to sound the alarm, but also to urge you all to take action. Any rational person knows that climate change is unfolding in real time. 2023 was the hottest year on record. Emissions are still rising globally. Sea levels are rising. We've watched the floods in Lismore, the Black Summer bushfires, the unprecedented heat in Antarctica in recent years. However, many of us tend to think that the solutions are to be found somewhere else. We think about climate policy as distant, the domain of technocrats in Canberra, scientists and diplomats at conferences of parties negotiations overseas, engineers working to improve technologies to reduce emissions at the source. And it suits us all to think this way because we don't have to take responsibility. We can defer to net zero targets, to the safeguard mechanism, to carbon capture and storage or offsets as technological fixes, to the 135 recommendations of a fracking inquiry, and other promises too numerous to count. It's always someone else's problem to solve. And the time for that kind of thinking is well and truly over. I took on my current role at ECNT because the place that I call home, the place that we call home, where I'm bringing up my 3 children, will be uninhabitable due to climate change within a generation. It's hard to believe it can get hotter here, but projections show that if we keep on our current trajectory, a huge swathe of northern Australia, including Darwin, will become exposed to extreme heat and be too hot for humans. What does that mean, really? At the moment, Darwin swelters through about 47 days per year of over 35 degrees, but that would reach 290 days by 2090. Combined with humidity, this puts human health at a tipping point for habitability as mussels literally melt down. There will be no children playing sport outside during the day. There won't be walks along Nightcliff foreshore during the dry season. No one will be able to work outside during the heat of the day due to the dangers of heat stress. So who will develop the north then? Politicians. We're already seeing significant impacts of climate change on all living creatures in other parts of the territory, and in recent months we've seen repeated flooding and evacuations in the communities of Pigeonhole, Yarralin and Dagaragu. A once-in-a-100-year rain event in the Borroloola-Barkly region has seen the Stewart and Carpentaria highways cut off for large periods of time and supermarket shelves here and elsewhere empty. Late last year, 2.8 million hectares of the Northern Territory burned across the Barkly and Central Australia, with cinders darkening the sky above Alice Springs, and millions of people and creatures suffering. Not millions of people, millions of creatures suffering. Of course, no one paid attention in the south. We're too far out of sight and out of mind. Amid this, we are pursuing mass expansion of the fossil fuel industry in this place, with fracking in the Beetaloo Basin, offshore gas projects like Santos's Barossa project, and the taxpayer-funded construction of the Middle Arm Gas and Petrochemicals Hub generating hundreds of millions of tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions. So tonight what we're trying to do is to make the threat of climate change real to you all by bringing together the expertise of an internationally renowned climate expert who is as comfortable in UN negotiations as he is in Darwin speaking to all of you. And we're also very delighted to platform a range of local experts and leaders who are courageously taking action on climate change against the grain of the dominant political paradigm here. We will explore how climate change is impacting communities across the Northern Territory and what needs to be done to arrest it. You will learn that it's not okay to sit back and do nothing, to trust politicians to do the job for us. The discussion may be raw and uncomfortable, but it's a conversation we need to have. And we're absolutely delighted to bring Dr. Bill Hare here to Darwin to speak with this panel of experts from across the Northern Territory, who I'm going to introduce as the panel discussion progresses. So the format will be casual and relaxed. It's a bit of a question and answer session with people explaining their own role in fighting against climate change, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions from the audience. For now, I will introduce Bill Hare, who is a physicist, climate scientist, and CEO of non-profit Science and Policy Institute Climate Analytics. He has contributed to the development of the international climate regime since 1989. Bill was a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Fourth Assessment Report, led the influential World Bank Turn Down the Heat Report series in 2013 and 14, and is one of the leaders of the Climate Action Tracker. He has been described as the go-to climate advisor of the most vulnerable countries, particularly the small island states and the least developed countries. In 2022, he was a member of the UN Secretary-General's high-level expert group on non-state actors' net zero commitments. Can everyone please welcome Bill Hare? So I'm going to ask the first question, and then I'm going to go to our panel of experts to ask their questions. So, Bill, I've got a question for you. What is the main cause of climate change, and why does what we do in the Northern Territory matter?
Is that better? Sounds like it's good. Okay. Look, thanks for those welcoming comments, and it's great to be back in Darwin. I used to come here regularly until the early 90s. I haven't been back. It's quite a shock to see the development here, but it's really fantastic to be here and to see such a great crowd. Now, what's causing climate change is the emission of greenhouse gases caused by human activities. The main cause of that is fossil fuel use, and that emits carbon dioxide. And we know with great certainty that the observed warming of the last decades is attributable to those emissions. In other words, it's human-induced. There's very little doubt about that scientifically, and the main cause remains carbon dioxide emissions from burning coal, oil, and gas. So that is the context. The scientific debate is long over about the causes of climate change, and so is the debate about what needs to be done to stop the warming. That means we need to be reducing fossil carbon dioxide emissions, in other words, phasing out ultimately all fossil fuels. So the Northern Territory is pretty much on the front line of climate impacts. It's a truism in the climate impact space that Australia as a continent is one of the most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Not that it has a high population, because other places have much higher populations exposed, but because of our environment, our ecosystems, our infrastructure are very vulnerable to the extremes that we expect to see and have seen, as Kirsty referred to here. So the Northern Territory is not excused from that. You've heard a litany of recent impacts, and as Kirsty said, the projections are that will get rapidly worse unless we bring these emissions of carbon dioxide from fossil fuels under control. Now, the good news is, before I hand back to you, is that if we do manage to reduce emissions quickly, in general terms, we know we need to be reducing these emissions by roughly half by 2030, down towards zero by 2050, then we will bring warming to a halt very quickly.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Bill. I'm now going to throw open to our panel. And the first people I will introduce are two stalwarts of the campaign to stop fracking in the Beetaloo Basin, Elaine, Sandy and Janet Gregory. And they are both Jingili women from the Beetaloo Basin region. They're sisters and both directors of Nurrdalinji Aboriginal Corporation. And they established Nurrdalinji back in 2020 because they became aware of the risk posed by fracking to land, water, cultural sites and wildlife. And they wanted to advocate and care for their traditional lands and waters. So I'm now going to throw over to Janet and Elaine to talk a little bit about what they're fighting for, what they're worried about, and to ask a question of Bill.
Thank you, Kirsty. Hello, everyone. My name's Janet. I'm the eldest in my family, and Elaine is my younger sister. We have been fighting for our country for so many years because we knew there was something different happening within our country, because we started to see the country changing through climate. The weather was changing. It wasn't like how it was when we were growing up. and how our parents were growing up. There were stories we heard about the country, how it was definitely not the same as it was before. It was like they were saying that it was sick. The country was sick because of what was happening. There are some people in our community, yes, they agreed to fracking because they wanted the money. And that was the catch to them. It was like a, how do I say it? Something dangling, a carrot dangling for them to sign papers for an agreement. And they did that without actually knowing what they were doing. But the NT government and the mining company did not really explain to them the danger or the damage it was going to do to our land and to our water, to our river. Our river, which is Newcastle Water Creek, they call it, it runs offset from Roper, and it goes past where they're fracking, and it goes all the way to what we call Jigaya, which is Lake Woods. I don't know if any of you heard of Lake Woods. And in Lake Woods, that's a sacred place because we look after that country. During the dry, we have migrating birds coming in from other country, but there was, we were told that these birds came from Russia, and they stay there for a couple of months and they nest, and they have young ones, and then they move on to Lake Air. Now, that water that goes from the mining, it goes straight into Lake Woods through a swimming area we call, the white people call it Long Reach, but to us it's Ijibada. And that's where we fish, we camp, and we spend time there with our families. Now, if that poison water is going through our country and it goes all the way, it will affect everybody. And not only that, it will affect our children, the young ones that are growing up. And that's why we formed Nurrdalinji, because Nurrdalinji in the Alawa tribe means mixed tribe. So it's Alawa people, Jingli people, Mudbara people, and the other tribes that are there. I forgot what they're called, but they're all from below Catherine region. And every year we meet together and we talk about how are we going to talk not only to our people, but also to the government. It seems they're not listening to us, like they're not listening to anybody, I don't think. All they want is the money from the mining company. Everything has a dollar sign. They don't care about the lives that's going to be affected. And that's what we're here for today. We're representing our people, our country, to talk to friends, and I hope we're among friends, to say, we have to keep fighting, we have to keep standing up. Otherwise, nobody will be living in the Northern Territory, I'm telling you. Nobody. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. Nurrdalinji commissioned a very, very important report from Bill Hare and Climate Analytics at the end of last year, which looked at this question of how and whether you can offset the emissions from the Beetaloo Basin. And I'll remind you all that one of the recommendations of the Pepper Inquiry was that life cycle emissions, domestic greenhouse gas emissions from the Beetaloo Basin should be completely offset, and that promise remains unimplemented. So the question for you, Bill, in relation to that report in the Beetaloo Basin is, what about offsets? Are they a valid way to deal with the emissions caused by projects like the Beetaloo Basin?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for your intervention. Actually, just an observation. The stories you tell about the impacts you're seeing on land, I hear all over the world now. And I hear it a lot from our mates in the Pacific Islands. I hear it in West Africa, where we work, and the Caribbean. So I think what you're experiencing and feeling is something that many, many are feeling and very painfully. Now, the offsets issue is in Australia in a bit of a strange space. So in Australia, we have become used to the idea of having a ton of fossil fuel emissions and planting a tree to take up a ton of carbon to offset that. That's what's called offsetting. You have a ton go in the air, you put a ton in trees or in the soil, and you think it's equivalent. Unfortunately, the Earth system is not so simple. It's complicated. So why? Carbon dioxide added to the atmosphere has a very long lifetime. If you add a ton of fossil carbon to the atmosphere, 30 or 40% of it will still be there in 100 years. In 1,000 years, 25%, and after 10,000 years, 15 to 20% roughly. So you'd have to guarantee that an offset, a ton of carbon in the ground was going to stay there for tens of thousands of years to offset that ton of CO2 you put in the atmosphere, because that whole time that ton of CO2 is in the atmosphere, it is warming the planet day after day, year after year. So that's a part of the physical reason why offsets don't work. Now, why aren't offsets permanent, you might ask? Why, if you plant a tree and or sequester carbon in soil, isn't that permanent? Well, we all know that vegetation can burn down, can be influenced by storms, droughts, fires, and so on. And that's absolutely what happens to carbon that you plant in a tree or store in the soils, that it is not permanent. Legally in Australia, offset companies are only required to keep it there for 25 years, in some cases 100 years in others. And there's no real price to pay if that carbon is released back to the atmosphere. Now, if you do the maths, actually, a guy from ANU did this first, I think over 20 years ago. Actually, you end up being worse off using offsets than if you did nothing in the first place. It's a bit counterintuitive, but if you think about it, it makes sense. So here you are. You have the choice of not emitting a ton of CO2, or you have the choice of emitting it and offsetting it, right? In other words, you could reduce a ton, or you could emit it and offset it. Now, in the case where you emit that ton and offset it, ultimately that carbon gets back into the atmosphere, and you end up with more carbon in the atmosphere than you would otherwise have had. So the warming is actually worse. So that's often not understood here, but we're one of the few countries that actually legally mandates offsets. I think at our last count in the Climate Action Tracker, we found Kazakhstan does this. And not even very well, but it's about the only place you can actually do it. So the bottom line is offsets can be very attractive because if you're a landholder, then you can get money for selling that carbon, and the government will give you money, a fossil fuel company will buy it and emit a ton of carbon as a consequence. In the end, you're not doing yourself a great service if you're worried about the land, because that carbon will come back, keep warming, keep heating, and you'll be also ultimately liable for any loss of that carbon from your land. So by and large, it's not a good idea. The way it works, finally, the way it works in Australia is a liquefied natural gas company could, for example, buy a ton of carbon to offset its production emissions, but for every ton of carbon it buys, it allows 8.5 tons of carbon to be shipped offshore in the form of liquefied natural gas. So you get a multiplier effect, an unfortunate one. A ton of offsets can lead to 8.5 tons, 8.4 tons actually, of emissions elsewhere that would not otherwise have happened. So that's part of the problem with it.
Thank you. I've just started coughing.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that response, Bill. I'm just going to pass to Sam, and if you could please talk about how your experience of climate change you live in Katherine, and how it's impacting the community in Katherine. If you can talk to that, and then also ask a question of Bill. Oh, sorry, I didn't do the introduction. Sorry. So Sam is a remote area vet who has lived in the NT for the last 30 years, and she's raised her 3 daughters here. Her family has strong ties to Tennant Creek, and when the idea of fracking in the Beetaloo was first being discussed around 2012, Sam became an advocate for country and water and climate, And it's fair to say that Sam has been in for the long haul in the fight to stop fracking. In 2022, she founded the grassroots group in Catherine called Protect Big Rivers, and that's a region which is now under direct threat from cotton fracking and mining expansion. So thanks, Sam, for joining. And sorry, we'll jump to the, if you can talk about the impacts of climate change that you've noticed over your time living in Catherine and how it's impacting the town and the community there.
Thanks for coming, everybody. I could talk about dead trees and dead landscapes and water running out and cattle starving and fish dying in water holes, and all of that is our reality. But I'm actually going to talk about what it does to the social fabric of these small remote towns, because every build-up there is a question among people who have family elsewhere of, when are you leaving? Has this one done you in? And in 2019 in Catherine, we experienced 54 days over 40 degrees compared to our historical average of 7 days. And during that year, we lost doctors and lawyers and nurses and real estate agents and teachers and people who could make a good coffee and chefs, and all of that destroys relationship in small towns. And when you have a destruction of relationship in small towns, particularly where there is already a strong racial divide, when you lose relationship, that racial divide becomes magnified. And I think what we're seeing now, and I'm not saying it's the sole reason, but I think what we're seeing now is actually a consequence, in part, of 2019. Because if you have relationship and you have a consistent teacher at school and you've known that teacher since year 7, then that teacher can see if things are out of kilter. And they might know the auntie or they might know the grandma to speak to. But if you have a new teacher every year, or, you know, in the case of a lot of kids at Catherine High, every term, then that alters. If you know your GP, your cancer gets picked up. If there is no GP, and we've gone for periods of, you know, a year and a half with no GP in Catherine, then you're presenting to ED and you're getting these young doctors who are missing things. So then you've got cancer that's quite advanced, and then you're out of town, then you're gone. So you need bus drivers to drive kids to school. You need teachers' aides in classrooms to hold kids steady. And all of that disappears every build-up in our towns. And then in remote communities, it's magnified, because there you need, you know, your main sort of crux of imported labour is health clinics and councils. And you lose a relationship with community at health clinic and at council, and you have this high staff turnover. So all of a sudden, they're meaningless places of foreigners. And it's really sad, because what has been a wonderful and shared community where everybody picks up for each other, and that levels off the socioeconomic distinctions. You know, if you've got fuel in your car and that kid knows you and you can run that kid home, that's really different to that kid having to walk 5K home in the heat and what happens along that way. So that's what I wanted to talk to tonight, because I've talked about dead fish for a really long time. Are we asking questions? Bill, gas is a transition fuel and we need it.
Totally. Sorry, Kirsty. Well, that's the problem. It's a big mantra from the gas industry all around the world, actually. And it's been a very, very long time since gas was a transition fuel. If you look at the science of it, I mentioned we have to get down to pretty close to zero emissions by 2050, particularly from fossil CO2. And to do that, we have to get rid of fossil fuels quickly. And everyone's heard about coal. And the coal has to go out of the system quite quickly, and that means out of the power sector globally by 2040. Right? A big challenge. But what is not so well known is that gas follows roughly the same path with a delay of only 3 to 5 years. Why? Because if you put gas into the power system, in Asia, for example, as Asia gets out of coal, you will slow down the transition there dramatically. Gas will outcompete, because it's subsidised in many ways, renewables and advanced electrification. And that means you end up with much higher emissions, and probably even half a degree higher than you would otherwise have got. So everyone in this field knows that if they're not working for a gas company, that you've got to get out of gas fairly quickly. And you've got to do it at about the same rate with a slight delay compared to coal, and you get out of it by using renewables. So we know that renewables can pick up the load very quickly, and that's one of the very fortunate things about the very terrible situation that we're in, is that we've never had renewables so cheap. In fact, photovoltaics at utility scale are probably the cheapest power humanity's ever created, and one of the fastest to roll out. Wind is more expensive, but also very important, and battery storage is essential to maintaining our lights on, air conditioning overnight, when the wind isn't blowing, when the sun doesn't shine. I keep telling the gas industry we know the sun doesn't shine at night, but anyway, the thing is it's cheaper and faster, and it also generally has more jobs. So when you replace a conventional fossil power system with renewables and battery storage and so on, you end up with more jobs, not just in the construction phase, but longer term. There's more jobs per megawatt hour of a renewable-based system than a coal or gas-based system. So that's it. There are harder things to replace, of course, than gas in the power sector, but we know we can replace natural gas in fertilizer, ammonia production by using green hydrogen, atmospheric extraction of nitrogen to make fertilizer. We know that in the chemical space, we can get rid of gas in chemicals with hydrogen, electrification. We know in high temperature heat applications in industry, where gas is often used, that we can get rid of 70 or 80% of the gas by replacing the heat source with a high temperature heat pump. So we basically know what the solutions are, and in most of the cases, it's commercially available now in different places. So it is possible, and it can be done, and it will be very beneficial economically for people.
Thank you so much, Bill. I'd now like to introduce the wonderful Therese Burke, who is a Malawi traditional owner from the Tiwi Islands, and she's been an absolutely staunch campaigner against Santos's Barossa gas project. Therese has travelled to Canberra, Japan, South Korea, to let politicians and investors know that this project is being pursued without Tiwi consent and puts Tiwi sea country and climate at risk. And she's absolutely tireless in her advocacy and campaigning work. So I'll now invite Therese to speak a little bit about her perspective on climate change and what she's doing in the Tiwi Islands, and then perhaps ask Bill a question. Thank you, Therese.
Thank you. I've lived on the Tiwi Islands my entire life, and I've seen the water come up, trees falling down along the coastline, biggest mob of trees just going down because the water get too high. And that worries me. That worried me over my many years living there, because I knew something wasn't right. And when we found out about the Barossa project happening close to us, that was made me really, really anxious. And like the changes that happened to my community, like this year alone, I went away for it was the mango season. I went away for 2 weeks. When I left, there was biggest mob mangoes on the tree. 2 weeks later, I came back, they was all gone. I said to my daughter, what happened here? Did the kids come in and steal the mangoes? And she said, no, they just stopped growing. That's the first time I've seen something like that this year. So I think it's got something to do with climate change, just like that. And when we went over to Japan and South Korea, they really polite people, and they sit and they look like they're listening really carefully to you, but I couldn't really tell. So I don't know whether we made any impact at all to them. And so with Santos Mob there at the moment, how it's affecting us, we're now seeing helicopter, like I'm sitting on the veranda and I can see helicopters flying past with these big pipes hanging down. They're going up and down. They go with the pipes, come back. And then we even got told we're not allowed to go fishing near where the drill site is. That's our sea, that's our home, and we're being told, now you're not allowed to go there. One boat even got told to F off from that area by those mob, Santos mob. So that's the sort of thing we having to deal with. We got this anxiety that something, because of climate change and the global heating, we're going to get more cyclones, and I've mentioned this to them. I said, something might happen. Your drill rig something may happen to it. It's going to ruin Tiwi coastline. And that's something that we Tiwi mob are really anxious about, causing us health problems because we're anxious about what might happen. And also being told you can't go there. That's our home. That's our sea area, sea country. And to be told something like that by people we don't know, it's really stressful. So we really have to fight to save our planet from all of this rubbish. Thank you. I wanted to ask you. Yes. Dr. Bill Hare. When we have those gas mob come over there, and the government, and they tell us that the emissions from their projects is it's only a fraction of the global emissions, and it can't be considered significant. How should we respond to that, and where does the responsibility lie?
Yeah, good question. You know, every gas company on the planet says that. You know, literally everyone about their single thing they're doing. It might be Sangomar in Senegal. It might be a new development of Trinidad and Tobago, or Exxon of Guyana, or you know, new developments in Western Australia, and they all say the same thing. It's not much. It's little. Please leave us alone. The truth is, of course, that it all adds up to a global catastrophe, right? And you hear this also, you know, quite a lot from the political class in Australia. I was in Canberra at the same time as some of you were a few weeks ago. I did the rounds, and I heard the argument, look, Australia, yeah, we know, but you know, it's China, it's the US, it's the EU, we're only 1 or 2% of global emissions, and you know, we're doing our best. Well, of course, if you add up every country that was only 1% of global emissions, you'd have a quarter of the world's emissions. If you added up every country that's under the size of Germany, you've got 39% of the global emissions. In other words, it doesn't work. Everyone has to play their role in this, otherwise the problem can't be solved. We can't get to zero. Of course, the big emitters have to do it. And I know the gas industry makes an industry out of basically engaging PR firms and others to argue why their gas thing doesn't really matter because someone else's gas thing is worse. That's also a game they play, which does bring me to Barossa. Barossa is, as far as I can tell, going to be one of the most carbon-intensive liquefied natural gas plant on the planet. If you think about it in simple terms, for every tonne of liquefied natural gas we export from Western Australia, or Darwin until recently, about half a tonne of greenhouse gas emissions are emitted. That is half a tonne of greenhouse gas emissions for every tonne of liquefied natural gas we put on a ship here. Now, the rocket scientists at Santos seem to reckon that Barossa will somehow work, but as far as I can calculate, you're going to be looking at 1.5 tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions per tonne of LNG exported. And I'm pretty sure that's be one of the most carbon-intensive sources of liquefied natural gas on the planet, if not the known universe. But it is a really big mess, and for that company it's going to be a big problem actually selling that kind of stuff. And that's why they're focused on offsets and things like that in order to build what is partly called their social license to go on. Now, just a comment as well about your experience on the Tiwi Islands. I've worked a lot in the Pacific since the early 90s, and I've been to all of the main atoll islands, and the kind of experience you're having is a very common one. People are losing crops, they're losing their freshwater lenses, their trees are dying, or just being washed into the ocean, or the king tide comes and everything is flooded, like in Tuvalu a few weeks ago. Absolute mess. I think that's something that this country needs to pay a lot more attention to, but for its own islands and for the Pacific, because it is leading in the Pacific to the kind of social breakdown that you're talking about, where people are losing confidence that they have a future, and it's leading to enormous stress and enormous divides in these communities. And it's only going to get better if there's an outlook to how we actually stop this problem. I think there's a visceral fear about it, about what it means to lose a place that the ancestors have been in for thousands of years. So that's something that's really present in our part of the world. And I'm wondering also, I mentioned earlier today, it would be great to think about how we could bring some of the Pacific people together with our mob here, Tiwis and others, to talk about those common and shared experiences. I think it would be very important.
Thank you so much. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Louise Woodward. And Louise has been working as a paediatrician in the Northern Territory for the last 14 years and has growing concerns about gas expansion here. She's especially concerned with the lack of discussion about the health impacts for the community. And Louise has done an astounding job of mobilising doctors and health professionals in the Territory and across Australia to raise concerns about the health impacts of fracking in the Beetaloo Basin and the health impacts of the Middle Arm gas hub. She's been absolutely instrumental in making the issue of health front and centre in discussions around climate change, not just here, but across Australia. So it's my pleasure to introduce Louise.
Thank you, Kirsty, and thank you to everyone who's come to listen to Bill Hare and to all of us. And I think it's really important for communities to come together like this. I first realised I needed to start using my voice last year when Natasha Files greenlit fracking in the Beetaloo Basin. Before that point, I still I was feeling nervous, but I still thought that they would not do that. I was still naive at that point, but I'd been I'd had a lot of climate anxiety, and for the couple of years before that, I've often been walking around the hospital kind of thinking, what am I doing? There's this thing that's going on outside these walls. Governments don't seem to be taking it seriously, and yet I'm, doing this job, and it didn't feel like I was making the difference I needed to. And then after fracking was greenlit, I realised that actually this is an emergency. And I did realise that as a doctor, my voice is louder than other people's voices in terms of trying to get to governments and policymakers, and I felt that it was I needed to start using it. I was worried for my job, and I think that's why a lot of professionals don't use the loud voice that they have, because they're worried about their job. But I'd got to a point where my job actually, I felt like it didn't matter anymore because this was such an emergency. And the good thing I discovered is that I didn't get fired. And, you know, I was told not to go to the media, and I politely declined not to go to the media. And I still have my job even after doing that. And maybe that's because in Darwin, people don't want to come up here to work because we're in a climate emergency and we're on the front line. But that's where I guess coming together as people in a community, when your voice might be louder than other people's voices when it comes to politicians and other people in power, I think it really is important that we stand up, and we stand up together, because safety in numbers. And it's very unlikely any of us will get fired, actually. And we can make a big difference if we all stand up together and say, no, this has to stop. And I guess my question to Bill would be, I can't stop thinking about COVID and the public health emergency that was activated for COVID. The whole world seemed to stop and take this thing seriously. Actually, fossil fuels are a public health emergency, particularly for the residents living around these things. There's the climate change aspects, but there's also the direct health impacts of fossil fuel projects and the pollution they emit. And how do we stop governments from sacrificing communities and communities' health to the fossil fuel industry? The fossil fuel industry doesn't vote, but communities do vote. So how do we do it?
Yeah, look, it's a question that everyone's asking wherever I speak, and I think the answer is, you just hinted at it, it's to get your politicians changed. If they're not responsive, if your local member is not taking an interest and not supporting you in trying to solve these problems, then they're not representing you. And we fortunately live in a democracy, and we need to take that up, and we need to use our voice with our friends, with our colleagues, and work to either get the politician concerned to change their tune and take action seriously, or to replace them with someone who will. And we've seen quite a movement of that. Oh, sorry, yeah, so we need to basically mobilise to persuade our political representatives to come online with the right things, or we need to use our vote to change them to someone who is better and more able to represent the really serious concerns. And this happens to be quite a generic issue around the world, and social scientists have been looking at it and so on. Sometimes it's called a democratic deficit. I don't know whether that's the right phrase, but in Australia you certainly see a rising level of frustration from ordinary people in the large-scale tracking polls about political representatives' responsiveness to climate change concerns. So I think the time has come to really keep that in mind. And often people get told, well, you can do things in your life. You can change your light bulbs to LED. You can get a more efficient air conditioner. You can do this and you can do that. And surely you can, but the system-wide changes won't happen that way. They will only happen through government setting the framework for those kind of changes to happen, and providing the right kind of regulation and incentives for that to occur. if government doesn't do that, then these changes will not happen. There's been a generation of governments talking about Japan very politely about how they focused on voluntary industry measures and so on, and every year I go back there and they say the same thing and nothing's happened. By the way, every year they're very polite, and every year they tell me Japan's going to build 20 new nuclear power plants. They've been saying that for a generation and nothing's happened. So I get it. So it's really putting the onus back on our political representatives to change. Otherwise, there's no way of changing the system, I don't think.
Thank you so much, Bill. I'm now going to ask Alice to explain a little bit about herself. Alice Nagy has lived and worked in the Northern Territory since 2011, has a 3-year-old child, and since having her daughter has become an active participant in the growing Darwin climate justice movement. Alice is a core part of the Parents for Climate Northern Territory group and has been working to hold governments to account on their climate commitments and lobbying for better climate policy. I'm also delighted to have snaffled Alice to come and work at ECNT in recent months, and Alice has put this entire event on. It's her vision, it's absolutely extraordinary, and she's a true superstar. So over to Alice.
Thanks, Kirsty, and thanks for having me at ECNT. I think ECNT is incredible, and there's an incredible team that also helped with this event tonight. So, sorry, I'll bring it a bit closer. Yeah, I guess for a long time, and maybe there are people in this room that feel in a similar position, but for a long time, I guess I was in the climate concerned camp, but not particularly active. For decades have read news articles and been through news stories and got increasingly anxious about the climate crisis. And in 2019, there were a few turning points for me that really that galvanized me into becoming much more active. One of those was the bushfires in New South Wales, my home state, when we just saw these incredible and awful bushfires rip through most of New South Wales, killing billions of animals, but also killing people and having really serious impacts for communities down there. And I think that was kind of quite an apocalyptic moment. And that really, I found that deeply concerning. And then, unfortunately, COVID came along. I think there were a lot of people that were quite mobilized to be active in the climate space at that time because it did really rattle so many people. And then COVID, unfortunate for many reasons, but also I think shifted the focus away from climate as that conversation was really, really sort of becoming stronger. But then the other thing that happened, I got pregnant in early 2022, and midway through my pregnancy, I heard all of Scott Morrison's gas-fired economic recovery rhetoric. And that was a moment for me where I just realised that we can't trust our politicians, we can't trust our elected representatives to set us on the right path. We actually need to make sure that we're directing them where we need to go to have a safe future. And so that for me was a really key moment. And of course, one of the centerpieces of Scott Morrison's gas-fired economic recovery plan was fracking in the Beetaloo. And so here I am feeling a lot of climate anxiety, pregnant with gas-fired economic recovery in the Northern Territory and Beetaloo with this project that when I started looking into it more, there's the impacts to communities down there and traditional owners and country and water, but also the emissions load. We're not just talking about a small amount of gas. The emissions load from the Beetaloo is incredibly significant. Some of the upper estimates are 117 million tonnes CO2 equivalent annually, which that equates to 22% of Australia's annual emissions load. So it's not just a small amount. They're upper estimates. Bill can also talk to that probably much more proficiently than me, but in terms of it's still a huge emissions load. And so I guess for me, I kind of see as much of a burden as it is and awful as it is that these projects are happening in the NT, it's actually an opportunity for us to have a real impact on the climate in a positive way if we get engaged in stopping these really damaging gas projects that are happening here. So that's how I became much more active and mobilised. I'd also like to, as the more I've become engaged in this, I've also realised how influential the oil and gas industry is in undermining true action on climate. And especially here in the Northern Territory, it's, you know, like we've seen the 135 recommendations of the Pepper Inquiry that haven't been implemented, although they're saying they have. It's very concerning, but I guess I just want to know from you, how influential is the oil and gas industry globally?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. I guess a turning point in the influence of the gas industry globally was the illegal Russian invasion of the Ukraine. So at that time, the gas industry mobilized. I remember being alerted to a meeting in the US Embassy in Berlin. I tried to gate crash, which the US had convened with the CEOs of all the big gas companies and European majors, you know, a strategy to try and replace the Russian gas from the European market. And there was a lot of panic about that because thought people might freeze in Europe because the Russians turned the gas off and so on and so forth. Well, actually, the reality turned out to be very different, and Europe got by very systematically with reducing overall gas use and so on. But on the back of that whole Ukrainian Russian-induced energy crisis, the gas industry ran rampant around the world. So everywhere you went, you discovered that they were doing stuff. They were proposing to build, 20 megaton LNG plant off Mozambique. They were building new facilities in the Emirates, Qatar, here as well. You heard it in Western Australia, at least, and other parts of the world. And then a massive program of building new LNG import terminals, export terminals began, to the point where we had a look at this in the Climate Action Tracker 18 months ago. Absolutely massive oversupply, absolutely massive, double, triple what the world needs is under construction. So what that translates into, these guys got to sell that stuff. So what I've seen is a massive resurgence in the oil and gas industry's political efforts since the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. I have the impression that, frankly, they're out to smash the entire climate policy system. I've been quoted in various news sources over the last year or so saying that because of my observation of what they are trying to do everywhere. They are trying to basically bust up climate policy. They are trying to intervene in markets. They're trying to sell LNG import terminals to places like Pakistan or whatever, like Pakistan, like a fish that needs a bicycle. It doesn't need new LNG. And they're doing that all over the place. And they're doing it with the backing and support of governments. So our own government federal government is active in this space as well. So everywhere you go throughout Asia, they've been there. They've been talked to the Koreans, they've talked to the Vietnamese, they've talked to the Filipinos, they've talked to whoever about more gas. Not about green hydrogen, not about Australia being a renewable energy superpower, but about gas, right? So I think it's extremely influential. It's at an apex now, and it looks to me like it's a life and death thing for this industry, right? They have to get these plant amortized, they have to sell the gas, and they're going to do whatever it takes to get the markets. Stepping back a bit, I worked in Europe for 25 years actually, and came back to Western Australia in 2017. I go backwards and forwards to Europe about half time each year, but it took me a long time to realise just what had happened in the time I'd been away. But in Western Australia, the gas industry owns the system. It's something that took me a while to work out, but it just owns the system. And there's no other way to explain what goes on there, because at the end of the day, there's not many jobs. there's hardly any money comes in. It's all talked about, but there's not much if you look at the analysis of different economic groups. So somehow or other, the gas industry has basically captured the political class, and not just in Western Australia, here, and actually at the federal Labor level, I would say, very, very successfully. Why are they so influential? I don't really understand it, but they are. What I do know is that pushing back against that means people power. There's no other way than to have people saying, this is enough, we don't need this, we don't want it. The positive side of it might be that I think this industry is actually in trouble, despite all the hoopla. But the gas market is softening. Under the Paris Agreement, we should be seeing quite a rapid decline in gas demand. That is beginning to happen in the Asian region. Prices are softening. It doesn't seem to me that this is going to be very profitable for very long, right? So I think that there's an opportunity now to take advantage of those market conditions to basically bring projects that are in the pipeline to a halt and begin the process of phasing out the existing industry. Why and how? Well, this industry relies on a depletable resource under the seabed, under the ground, and stopping the supply is a first-class way to phase this industry out and get that capital that would be invested, and billions of capital invested, into the alternatives. Because it's capital now going into fracking or subsea development that could be going into developing the alternatives, right? It will go somewhere else. Banks, investors will go somewhere else and get a larger return if they can't do that. The world would not stop. We will find ourselves in a better place.
Thank you. And now I'm delighted to introduce our last panel member, Mililma, who needs no introduction on her own country. But Mililma is a Kulumbirigin, I'm sorry if I have not pronounced that correctly, Millie, Danggalaba Tiwi woman and the CEO of Uprising of the People. UP is an advocacy organisation that speaks up about country and young people. And Mililma's absolutely incredible, inspiring advocacy focuses on centring the rightful knowledge holders and building community with all those who live here. Thank you, Mililma.
Thank you for having me. Wait, why am I thanking you? This is my country. Anyway. Thank you, ECNT, and thank you, Bill, and thank you to my amo here with me tonight, and thank you to all of you for coming. Yeah, as Kirsty said, I'm Mililma, and I started Uprising back in 2019 after Kumanjay Walker was shot by police in Yundamu. And Uprising started as a young people-led protest group, really. And then over the years, we have moved into not a separate thing. Climate justice and youth justice and Indigenous justice is all interconnected. And justice for us as Aboriginal people is justice for everyone. When we centre the right knowledge holders and listen to our elders, then everything else falls into place. And we saw that, and we are seeing that with the Lee Point movement. That reason that has been so successful to date is because the rightful knowledge holders have been leading that movement, centering the cultural knowledge, supported by the staunch solidarity and allyship of everyone who lives not only here on Kulumbirigin but across the country. Last year, I got invited to sit in a meeting with, it was the Tamboran AGM. It was terrible, horrible, don't recommend. It was disgusting. And we were there with the CEO and the board of Tamboran, who are a gas company, who are fracking in the Beetaloo. And we got to witness them all give themselves pay rises in that very meeting from $1 million a year to $1.3 million a year. amongst other things, as well as saying that they are going to expand Beetaloo. And it was really gut-wrenching to be there, and I was actually physically sick for 2 weeks from that meeting alone. We also then met Tanya Plibersek an hour after that and sat down with her. And she pretty much told us point blank, we were trying to get the water trigger to come in so that we have a little bit more accountability around legislation here in the Northern Territory to protect our water and to try and stop fracking. And she pretty much point blank told us that unless you can make NT issues a national problem, we don't care. The Labor government, the Australian government, and the gas and mining companies openly discuss and talk about the NT as a sacrifice zone. It is on their websites. You can look it up on Tamboran. They have this huge map of Australia with this big arrow coming out of the NT pointing down to the east coast with all these dollar signs at the east coast. It's on the Tamboran website. You can see it for yourself. So let us not be gaslit. They are using our country to fill their pockets, and they are unrelenting in destroying this country. However, what they don't know is that all of us are connected through songline and bloodlines, and when we all stand together, we're stronger than the global empires of the gas industries. So in the same way that the gas industries like Tamboran and Santos are all best friends and they all protect each other, we have to remember that they are the minority and they are only a small group of people. Yes, they may be filthy, disgustingly rich, but they can't sit in a room how we are all here sitting today with the rage that we have in our hearts to care for country. And we are stronger than them because we actually move from a place of love rather than destruction and hate. So we can keep working and we can keep fighting forever because we're fighting from a place of love, not a place of greed and destruction. So on that, I wanted to ask Uncle Bill here, how have you kept going and found hope and joy amidst everything that you have seen and you're researching for your whole life? How do you keep going?
It's a good question, and as everyone knows, it's not always to keep going in any field. Sometimes in life things don't work out well, and the same thing on climate change, that's true, but I get a lot of energy from the people that I work with. And I have spent much of my career working with my friends in the small island states, and we've had some high points and we've had some low points in that context. And when it gets to a low point, I remember one particularly bad low point when the Copenhagen meeting in 2009, which was meant to be developing a new agreement, essentially cratered. Then I had to go to bush for 3 months to recover. And I got energy back from the bush, and I came back and we picked up that whole international process and ultimately got the Paris Agreement. And it was working with those countries and those individuals that gives you energy. It also tells you something else that's very, very important. We just cannot afford to lose this. We just cannot. And so there's a responsibility for those that know enough to basically keep at it, no matter how tough it is, and to constantly look for solutions, to look for way forward. Now, you made a point about solidarity, and I think that's relevant. I mean, I refer back to the Paris Agreement and its 1.5 degree limit, which the small island states were critical in securing in Paris. That wouldn't have happened without solidarity. And solidarity happened not just within that group, but across the vulnerable countries. I think by the time that meeting ended, we had 115 or 120 countries. And along the way, there were moments in which that solidarity was challenged. and challenged in the way that you've referred to, money, threats, and you have to deal with that. You have to basically find a way of circling the wagons, if I can use an American analogy, and rebuilding that solidarity. That's the only way. And in that solidarity, you also get strength to go on. I mean, there's another dimension to my life as well. It's been science, and that I get a lot of energy from the science. And sometimes the science is pretty depressing. And we have in our headquarters in Germany, we have we're not a PhD granting institution, but we do cooperate with universities granting PhDs. I have lots of PhD students, and they get to a certain point in their research. For example, you take the lethal heat and humidity research that has been we know about, and they're pretty upset about it. It's something that really is confronting, and I mean tearful upset. And so that's something that any professional in this field has to deal with, and it's something that you've got to work through. But it's important to know that we can still do this. The physics tells us that if we can get emissions down fast enough, we can bring warming to a halt pretty soon. And for those of us that live beyond the middle of the century, probably see improvements in the climatic outlook. And the other thing to know is that we've never had a cheaper way to do it. We've never had such cheap energy and such cheap technology, and that is an opportunity that is almost inconceivable 20 years ago. So for most of my career, it's been spent arguing with governments and industry it's too expensive, but the taxpayer should pay. Well, now it's immensely profitable, and what we're seeing now, what we're talking about with the gas industry, and not just the gas industry, but incumbents in whatever, internal combustion engines or the power sector, who stand in the way. And we just had the experience in Australia of going through this process of trying to get what everywhere else except Russia actually has, is motor vehicle efficiency standards. We're about the only place in the world that can't quite get there. And guess what? It got messed up because the political class listened to Toyota or whatever. It's too hard for Toyota. Well, we have to get our political class to understand, actually, if the rest of the world can do it, so can we. It's not so hard. And that comes from more people paying attention, more people talking. Go back to the point about actually creating the political pressure from electorates on the politicians. Last point, interesting point that Plebiscite made. You've got to turn this into a national issue. Well, I heard another message when I was in Canberra, and I did the rounds there, political staffers in the ministers' offices and so on. And the message I heard is very interesting. It's almost like an Exxon type message. It was, if you guys, climate activists, make this climate change problem a big national issue, you are going to get Peter Dutton elected, right? So I'm just saying that I wasn't sick for a week after Canberra, but I wasn't in a very good space. But I'm just saying that is the kind of message I got from people who should know a lot better working for the Albanese government. That's their big thing.
I have a question for you, Dr. Bill. Where I come from, that's the Beetaloo Basin. My hometown is Elliot. And the surrounding areas, there's 4 or 5 or 6 languages, indigenous languages. My question is, when you worked in Africa, did you speak the language, or did you have an interpreter to convey messages to the people there about what was damaging to their country?
The common language of West Africa is French. I think I'm banned from speaking French publicly, but I get by with it, and we have a Francophone team that does it. But also, there are many different language and cultural groups, actually even more diverse than here. If you're looking at a country like Mali or Senegal or Niger, then you've got very different religions and cultures on the coast compared to inland. So our team has to be able to deal with all of those, and all of those very complex relationships, and that involves language as well as getting some really good cultural understanding to make that. This is in the space of actually working out how agriculturalists and pastoralists can cope with the climate change coming, in that they won't be able to grow the crops or animals that have been grown for how many thousands of years? I don't know, 10,000 years in this region. So it's not easy to get that across. But you do need to have people who know the languages, otherwise it doesn't work.
That's good, because in my area, I speak 3 languages, Jingli, Mudbara, English. And I've got to interpret everything to do with country and especially with climate change. And there are other surrounding tribal areas who speak other languages. So in order to convey to them that, what is happening at Beetaloo and how it's affecting our country, they don't understand why it's flooding, why some of the bush animals have disappeared, why all of this are happening environmentally in our area. So if I'm only one person, if I was to go around and talk to people, I live in Alice Springs and I'm a renal patient. So I have to go around and talk to people. My sister lives there, but she don't speak what I speak. And I have lived longer. I'm in my 60s. I see the damages. I see what's happening. I see the changes in the country and the plants, animal, the sky, but to convey that in our language to them, to make them understand exactly, I don't know how to go about doing that, because Northern Land Council, who's supposed to be for us, is just telling them, $sign, you will get big money, big money, big money. That's all they're saying. But they're not talking about the damage that's going to happen to your country.
Yeah, I was just thinking along the same lines as her, like countrymen at home, all over, they see changes happening to our lives and our country, but they don't know what's going on, really, like this climate change. And I was just thinking before she was talking that I think that we should start to get back home into our communities and start telling everybody exactly what's happening and why these changes are happening. That's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, that's good. If I could just add there, look, what you're struggling with is something going on in lots of places, right? And I think that one thing to think about is to bring in Western scientists, if I can put it that way, who know about impacts and adaptation, to work with you to translate and understand those changes. This is trying to match together traditional knowledge and Western knowledge together, and that's not a fast process, but it's worth investing in. We do that in different places in the world, in a much more structured setting where you have regional secretariats and so on who facilitate that. There's nothing like that in Australia, but I think it's really worth thinking about how your communities could bring in, adaptation and impact specialists to find out what you're seeing and to pass on what they think might be coming, and to put that together, because that will then need to go into a whole new way of approaching land management and culture. There are parts of Western Australia now where people can't do cultural business anymore because it's too hot, right? That's one thing that's going on. And in the sea country, people can't do cultural business because the mangroves have all gone. So there's lots of stuff like that happening in Australia and around the region that we can learn from and help cope with.
So I think it's just been an astounding discussion, and I'll wrap up at the end. But we do have an opportunity for questions from the audience. Does anyone wish to ask a question of Bill while he's here, or anyone else on the panel?
Hi, I'm Sherry. I've lived in the Territory since 2006 and I've travelled around Australia. And I have a question probably for Bill, and it's in relation to green hydrogen. This term gets bandied about quite a bit, and you might be aware that there is a green hydrogen plant that's being built in Whyalla in South Australia. And I wanted to hear a bit more about green hydrogen and how green is it, and is that something that could be the future for energy? Thank you.
Yeah, look, it's a big question. Green hydrogen is going to be a very important part of our energy system in the future. Probably an essential part, but not as big as many are arguing. Why? It's actually very expensive to make green hydrogen. You need a lot of solar energy or wind energy to do it. You need a lot to transport it and use it. So that means that you should use it in applications where you really need it. So that tends to leave out the power sector because there are much cheaper ways to produce and store power. It doesn't mean that green hydrogen won't or shouldn't be used at all in the power sector, because there are systems where you might generate green hydrogen, if you like, and store it somewhere and use it for long-term storage. And there are a few examples now, but that probably won't ever be at big scale. Where green hydrogen is going to be very important is decarbonising some heavy industrial applications, including making steel, chemical fertilizers, chemicals, possibly very high temperature heat applications in industry where you need 300, 400, 500 degrees heat, which is 20 or 30% of heat needed in industry. So those applications are where it's most likely going to be needed and essential. It's not at all clear that green hydrogen is going to be useful in even the heavy transport area. You know, if you asked me 5 years ago, I would have said maybe heavy transport, because you don't see the battery storage density being working out. But battery storage density has increased dramatically. It's improving further. So that means you start to have road trains being built in South Australia with batteries that you couldn't have imagined 5 years ago, right? So that means probably hydrogen isn't going to play a big role in transport either, but it's a very important part of getting rid of carbon from steel, fertilizer, and so on. Now, as in anything that the humans do, there's going to be a good way and a bad way to do it, right? So that means that you could build or try and build renewable energy plant, whatever it is, photovoltaics, wind, that takes over a national park, or that takes over traditional lands. I know a project in Western Australia where there's a big threat there. So you could do it that way, and it would be very destructive. It would be another kind of mining activity, I think. But there are ways to actually build these systems without destroying new land. It's usually a matter of convenience for the developer, or slightly cheaper. So I think you need to look very carefully at the green hydrogen production system and make sure that you don't sacrifice the natural environment to build massive solar and wind. I think that would be a really serious mistake. And often it doesn't work out to be more expensive, actually. It's just the preference of a developer. And when you actually crank the numbers, you find out, well, it might not be that much more expensive to do it in already cleared land or on a farmland where you need to do a lease rather than pastoral land where there's no one to pay anything to.
Hi, how you going? couple of questions. A really quick one for you, Bill. When they measure how many emissions come out of, say, a ton, how many greenhouse gases come out of a ton of LNG or something, do they take into account how many emissions are burnt in, FIFO, the FIFO workforce, the diesel that gets used, all of that, the steel, the embodied energy and all of that? And the other question is for Sam about, I think that perspective that you spoke about is a really good one. Like, I work for AMSAN and I work in health, Aboriginal health. And, we're seeing exactly what you're saying, and no one's articulating it in a way like that. It's a really great way of thinking about it. And I live and work in Central Australia, and I've seen, buffel grass take over country in unprecedented expansion. And recently I just went out to Kintor, and you can't even walk through the buffel grass to go, to take a squat when you're driving out bush, let alone people being able to access country for culture. You can't see animal tracks, there's no biodiversity. And so I think it's that thing you say about community being separated and relationships breaking down. I wonder if you're having that conversation more broadly, and if so, where and in what have the responses been? Because I wonder if it's a way to pivot and we've spoken about science forever, and we've been speaking about a whole lot of climate-related stuff in that way for a long time. And I wonder if pivoting, where the anti-government's stressing about not being able to keep nurses in communities, if that's a different. And have you spoken to others about that yet?
Yeah, great. Look, emissions from liquefied natural gas plant, I'm sure they have calculated stuff like that, but I don't particularly trust the numbers coming out of the government or industry on the total greenhouse gas emissions from these facilities. The numbers I quoted earlier, I think, are very conservative and don't account for what we know to be significant losses of methane from the production, transmission, distribution system to get to the LNG plants. Probably the numbers are double what I've said. I said half a tonne of greenhouse gas per tonne of LNG. Probably it's closer to 1 because of those unreported emissions. And we're getting new satellites up now. Methane Sat's the latest one. We're starting to get a handle on these releases. So I don't particularly trust them. And emissions are a lot higher. The embedded emissions in steel, transport, etc., are often calculated in life cycle analyses. You can find them in environmental impact statements and so on. How useful or relevant they are is often questionable, but they do exist.
In relation to that, I think the power structure of small towns needs to be really understood. You make money out of real estate. You have a chamber of commerce that makes money out of a town being a good place to live. Anything that disrupts that narrative is something that small towns don't want to hear. Councils don't want to hear it. Tourism operators don't want to hear it. I mean, tourism operators are at the forefront of it and they're dealing with it, so they're actually very on side because they're crunching the numbers in a very different way. Governments don't want to hear this, and they don't actually want the public to know. That's fundamentally what this is about now. And I think, I was down in Canberra, I've walked the halls as well in the last year a couple of times, and I asked Luke Gosling, you live here, and when you're raising your kids here, you obviously love it on one level here. What do you do with uninhabitable? What do you actually internally do with that? And his response was, the Northern Territory will never be uninhabited. It's too important strategically. So I think I just want to tell another anecdote. It's been playing on my mind. And there is a bit of a trigger warning for stolen generation people, so I will say that now. But I was talking to an Aboriginal friend and I said, I can't work out if governments are dumb or stupid with this stuff, you know, with fracking. Is it dumb or is it stupid? Sorry, is it dumb or is it evil, is what I asked her. And she said, whenever I ask myself that, and fracking is taking place very close to her country at Borroloola, she said, whenever I ask myself that, I just remember when they took me away from my mother. And I think what we all need to recognise is this is a layer of dispossession that Aboriginal people are really used to, but it is now ours. And in terms of speaking at that at a town level, that isn't where most rural communities are up to.
Oh, hello. My name's Jan. I think maybe this is for Kirsty. I was just wondering how many people in the Northern Territory work for the fossil fuel industry who vote.
I don't know if I should have that on the tips of my fingers, but I don't think I do right now. I think 2,000 work in the industry around Australia in the Northern Territory. So there's 2,000, which is what proportion of the overall population? A very less than 1%. So that's the reality.
Like small towns are beginning to experience small kickbacks now, though, and I think we need to be mindful of that because that is starting. The money is starting to filter in small, pathetic ways, but in small populations, small pathetic ways. Oh, he's doing all right out of it, so maybe I should jump on.
I'm Hamish Kenny, and I was born here in 2005. I've moved a lot around the country, though, and currently I'm studying my Bachelor of Science at CDU, and I just wanted to ask you, Dr. Hare, about any advice you could give a young person who's studying science, like advice on how to make change with science in the future.
Good question. Well, if you're interested in science, it's important you follow the science that you are attracted to and love. That's the first message I give my kids, and anyone who asks, it's really important to get passionate about some area of work. And then once you're into that area of work, you will find ways of using those skills that you have developed, uncovered within yourself to make a difference. There's no kind of good generic answer, and people will find different ways and places of finding their voice. But if you're focusing on science, choose an area that you really are passionate about and take it as far as you want. If you want to change direction, then change direction, go in another direction. That often happens in scientific careers, but if you're good at it and you're passionate, you will find a way to make a difference.
It is now 8 o'clock. There's someone who's had their hand up at the back for a long time. We might have one more question, and then people are very welcome to come and have a chat afterwards before we wrap up. But we have been sitting here for an hour and a half together.
Hi. I'm just interested in what the analytics you might have, Bill, on the way we design our environments, not just like how we're using our energy, but also the impact of the built environment in the way it traps us in ways of living. So we're in Toyota's cars that guzzling lots of fuel. We're caught in that system of paying for petrol and car maintenance. You know, we're dealing with equity for people in the streets of not being able to catch good transport, and the walking around away from cars is really bad. The infrastructure here could be better. But yeah, I'm wondering about the climate analytics and how it can be better for the way that we design our cities, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and there are very many dimensions to that. So designing a city or a town so it's walkable and usable without having to rely on motorised transport, electric or internal combustion, is a very big challenge for Australia. Very few places have actually taken the trouble to design their cities or towns in a way that are accessible in that way. So that doesn't mean it's not known. My old professor, Peter Newman, he's in Fremantle as a world-renowned expert in this, and he's written many books on it, but as you would admit, he's not made much progress in Australia. He's helped other cities, really. So it can be done. It's a very important discipline in its own right. And then there are other levels, like how do you make your city or town livable? And one answer is you don't make all the roofs black, right? And a deeper answer is you need the relevant building codes and so on that make sure buildings are suitable for the climate that's coming, that are energy efficient, and that reduce indoor air pollution and so on and so forth. In other words, livable houses. This is also not rocket science, but it's not a rocket science that we've mastered in Australia. We don't have really good standards for new buildings or retrofitting old buildings, even though it would benefit people. The Rewiring Australia campaign, some of you have heard about it, but you can look it up. The Rewiring Australia campaign has a lot of really fantastic information on this. And it's worth looking at that because that's a really big thing here. I mean, I lived in Europe for 25 years, and I must say, and in Northern Europe, 55, 56 degrees north, or sort of, we used to get snow, you don't much anymore, but, you'd think you'd be uncomfortable and cold, but I've never been more uncomfortable or cold since getting back here, and all my German friends say, we've never suffered so much in winter than being in Australia. Why? Because of the housing, right? And you know what? If you're young, it's a nuisance, but if you're old, it can be deadly, really deadly, and I think we have a big problem with that, and governments really need to get their act together. And, if you're thinking about remote communities, it's really extreme, really, really extreme conditions people are living in. I've got mates at Balgo, and they had 50 degrees this year. It's horrible, absolutely unlivable. And I don't know what it's like in the Northern Territory, but this is also something that's absolutely fixable with the right attention paid to by government.
So I think that brings us to the end of this evening. And I guess what I'd sort of like to dwell on briefly is, what should we all do now? And I know this evening's discussion has been difficult, challenging. I've felt a little bit teary at times hearing from each of our panellists this evening. But I'm also continually, completely inspired by the courage and the building momentum here in the Northern Territory, which I'm just so proud to be playing a small part in. These people up here are doing work that is risky, that is exceptionally brave. They get called trolls, they get called liars. Last week, hundreds of people turned up to oppose the Middle Arm gas hub at a Senate inquiry, and that was pilloried as a circus by people not just from the CLP but also in government here in the Northern Territory. So it's hard work that these people do, and I just want to say thank you so much for everything that you do. It inspires me, it inspires, I'm sure, everyone here in the room, and that's what gives me hope. So thank you. This work, even though it can be a bit scary at times, it's not fun to have big gas companies after you. It's not fun to have governments after you. It's also really nourishing work. It's nourishing for the soul. Just go to Lee Point and see what's happening there. If you happened to be on the Esplanade last week with the hundreds of people from every sector of the community banding together to protect this place in solidarity with Larrakia people, you can't help but be inspired. So I'm asking you tonight to be inspired by the people here on the panel. You've got a little piece of paper here. It's got a QR code on it, and it will link to a bunch of different climate groups and organisations that are doing amazing work here in the Northern Territory and nationally. You just have to get off the fence. I remember vividly the day my husband Mark, who's sitting at the back there, and I put the yellow triangle on our front gate. We went to, it was after the Gunner government had lifted the moratorium on fracking. I went to an event like this, Eitan Lenko was speaking, and we just said, well, we can't be on the fence anymore. We've got to show where we stand. And it was such a minor thing, but then it has led to our family being activists in the community and others doing the same. So go home, put a yellow triangle on your gate, join up these groups, join us. There's hundreds, actually, I can't tell you how many people are on our list because it would scare the politicians, but we have got thousands of people on our side, and we're building our power all the time, and we're here for a livable and safe future for all of us. I did just want to say a few thank yous, of course to our panellists, but especially Dr. Bill Hare, who is an absolute superstar. It's not many people who can casually throw into conversation. I went to a meeting and then the Paris Agreement happened. We're absolutely delighted to have you here, and it's just been a pleasure. And you know, we sold out this event in record time. And having someone of your calibre here is just extraordinary. So thank you. Also, ECNT team, you're all amazing. Every single one of you. Alice, no, not me. Alice, Bree, we've got the amazing Ella O'Brien at the back, who's been flicking the slides but has not been able to see the event. Who else is there? Lou DeMattia at the front. Jess has been living in a caravan at Lee Point. All of the ECNT team, I just am so grateful to have you all working with me, and all of you in our community. Thank you for showing up to these events. Keep showing up. Tell your friends. Bring them over to our side. It's a wild ride, and we're going to win. Thank you. That's it.